What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and today I'm going to be going back to the future. And to do that, I've got my own Doc Brown in the shape of Dave Horrocks from Comics in Motion podcast and VHS Strikes Back. Dave, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, sir. And like Doc Brown, I certainly am old.
Yeah. I said during lockdown, mate, we all feel old. We all feel old. So Comics in Motion and VHS Strikes Back and many others. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg for what you're doing in podcast land nowadays, isn't it? Do you want to give a pop to your network and to your other podcasting endeavours before we start?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've consolidated a little bit. What Chris and I are great at doing is spinning up new projects, and then they kind of it's like an evolution, you know, only the strongest survive kind of thing. So I'll start with Comics in Motion. So that initially started off with Chris and myself, and we were doing like TV and movie reviews. We did have aspirations of doing games, but actually the amount of time we'd have to put into that, we just ended up settling on the on-screen stuff. And over this last probably 6 months or so, we've ended up bringing on more and more creators and more shows to try and build up the podcast and this network. So, you know, we're not quite at a daily show. You've probably got something coming out roughly on average about once every couple of days. But honestly, Scott, I couldn't be happier with it because, I mean, Chris and I, you know, we're a one-man band. We're kind of like Wayne's World of the podcast world, I guess. That's kind of how I see us. But we've got such smart guys. I mean, a guy you know well who's been on the show, Mike Burton.
Yeah.
We did the Star Wars crossover event, didn't we? And it was so obvious that he knew so much about the comics and was so passionate. It was like, well, Mike, do you want to come on and do like just a show dedicated on Star Wars? And, you know, we'll drop that as a weekly show. And honestly, I have so much fun listening to it because it fills in a lot of the gaps. You know, the ones, Scott, that should be in the movies but aren't explained in the movies?
Yeah, they're the ones.
Those gaps. But then we also have like Tony Farina, who does like specializes in indie comics. So we have Indie Comics Spotlight there. We have Max Byrne, who tackles the absolute blockbusters of the comics world. So all the big things that have come out of DC and Marvel. And then one of the newest shows we've had is Superhero for Dummies. So we've got the guys there. We've got Steve, Paul, and Dan, and they've got varying knowledge. You know, Steve's a bit of, I think he describes himself as the nerd Yoda, and, you know, a bit of a fountain of knowledge. You know, Paul knows a bit, Dan knows a bit, but then they'll discuss a particular character. And then it helps the listener kind of come along and learn a bit about the history and, you know, because it's just a chat with friends kind of thing. So again, that's another favorite show of mine. And then finally, we've just released Comics on Trial, which is, you know, a kind of mock courtroom drama type thing. And that's going to be all of us. Scott, I hope including yourself, we'll get you on there. Of course, what am I saying? We're recording next week, aren't we? Yeah. So yeah, it's really exciting. You know, it's sort of organically built up to this thing. And I don't quite know where you know, it could lead. So really exciting. And I don't want to plug too much. It doesn't come naturally to me, but I'll just say about the VHS Strikes Back. So that's where, you know, we look at movies like Back to the Future and we just go through that kind of one movie at a time and we'll discuss, you know, what that means to us. It started off, episode 1 was Back to the Future. It started off, we thought we would go through all of the big blockbusters. And what it's sort of turned into is we kind of like going through the really bad ones as well. So a lot of similar shows, you know, focus on the big boys. But we've done stuff like Jim Carter, Eat My Dust, which is a Roger Corman movie with Ron Howard in it. But those are kind of the most fun. I mean, Samurai Cop, I just honestly had so much fun recording that one. And the last one I'll say is our reality TV cast. So Chris and Dave's reality TV cast. And I don't quite know how this has become this monster, but for some reason, I think Love Island in particular, that's our sweet spot. We get more listeners through that than probably all the other podcasts put together. It's nuts. And more interaction as well. It is absolutely bonkers. And yeah, absolutely love it.
Excellent. It is. You say you're taking over podcast land, man. You really are. You're doing the God's work. Is what you're doing. Doing the good work. I will say. I mean, the thing is as well. Some of the guys you've got working. I was going to say working for you then, like some overlord. You've got some guys that you've got now in Comics in Motion Network and stuff. Is great. I mean, not just yourself and Chris. As you say, Mike, who I've been on his show. He's been on here. He's a fantastic guy. Tony Farina. Is now actually writing an essay for the Judge Dredd book I'm working on. So I met him through you guys, and obviously I'm loving Superhero for Dummies because they're sort of they do Miracle Man, Captain Britain, some of my sort of sweet spots. So it's fantastic. It's a great endeavor, and if you are listening to this, you should be listening to that. It's a definite. If you like this, you'll be definitely liking what they're doing over there. So can't recommend it enough.
How good was the Miracle Man episode and the Captain Britain episode as well?
Yeah, it's stunning. It drove me back to my my omnibuses. I was like, oh yeah, got to get back and have a look at those. Love it.
And what I like is, and I include you in that as well, Scott. You've got this small group of like-minded individuals, and we all respect what each other does, and we all kind of get along. And honestly, I consider all of them friends. Podcast friends. I haven't met people face to face, but it's great. And I've ended up writing for Steve's website, so Fantastic Universes, and so I just really like it because you get a lot of these kind of podcast collectives and things, but this is a much closer knit community. So yeah, absolutely loving it.
Excellent. Yeah, it's great work. Right, Emmy, we're getting to today's thing. So today we are going to be talking about what I think is one of the best trilogies in sort of the genre sort of sort of sci-fi and horror sort of genre stuff. Back to the Future. Back to the Future Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3. So before we get into the sort of the films, I'll ask you, Dave, sort of like, where did you first get into this thing? Were you sort of able to go see Part 1, the first film at the cinema, or did you catch it on VHS? So how did you come across Back to the Future?
So rather ashamedly, I can't actually remember. It's one of those movies. I mean, I was 9 when this came out of the cinema, so it's not like I was 4 or 5 or something and shouldn't have a memory. I should have a memory of this, but it just feels like it's always been there. The predominant memory is just having it on video and watching it over and over again. And I just, it's one of those that you get to the end of it and you quite happily just go back to the beginning again. And I think I'm not sure we had a legit copy of it. With the VHS, you could always do the trick with the old sellotape over the back of it and do the copying. Like, sorry for chucking you under the bus there, Dad. So yeah, it was one of my favourites for sure.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. It's one of those, I mean, I was 4 in 1985, so I didn't go to the cinema, but it's one of those films that we had a copy of this that I can't remember. It was like a red VHS tape that was recorded just one Christmas. And then it was just sort of, luckily it was on the BBC, so there were no adverts. But it was just one of those films that I just remember. I never had an official tape like yourself. It was just, I had a cassette of it, and I just watched it to death. And then the sort of so when the rest of the series came out, like 2 and 3 came out in 89 and 90, like there was no way I wasn't going to the cinema to see them.
Yeah.
But like you say, it's just one of those sort of 80s films, I think, that just sort of exists. It just sort of it sort of arrived and just sort of has become sort of a bit of an icon, and luckily has never been remade or rebooted, and never should.
Oh, can you imagine? Oh God! Don't tempt
Well,
fate.
well, yeah. The thing is, having watched this time, and I can't. There's very little I can fault about the first one. I'm pretty sure if Chris was on, he'd rip it to pieces in some way.
I think this is one of the rarities where I think for Chris, he'll either completely crap all over it or it's untouchable. You know, things like Smokey and the Bandit. You know, you can't say anything against it. Lethal Weapon. But I think, honestly, Back to the Future. In fact, you know, I do think I recall Chris saying Back to the Future is his favourite trilogy. And I was saying I'd be hard pushed, but honestly, a bit controversial. I think now, in 2020, if I think about all of the trilogies, I think Captain America is probably my favourite trilogy. I mean, what about yourself as a bit of a left field question?
No, I agree, and I love of all the MCU sort of, especially that sort of Phase 1 characters. Like the Captain America trilogy is definitely my favourite. But what I would say is, for that is that the Captain America trilogy, it doesn't stand alone. Like the first one does, like First Avenger, like does, and I suppose like Winter Soldier does to an extent. But Civil War, like you need to have knowledge of the wider MCU.
Yeah.
So you know it's great because I love the MCU. You know, but I think if you were to look at like individual trilogies, I was really thinking about this. Like if you were to look for individual trilogies that stand alone in, you know, and haven't been sullied by a follow-up or something like that. Like there's very few that have I would say the consistency of quality of Back to the Future. You know, and I'm not gonna say they're all great. They are all great, but there are definite flaws with some of them. But like, you know, Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy or the Godfather trilogy, or really swinging for the fences here with some of these. But like, there are certain trilogies you go, yeah, that's really, really good. But then they sort of, you know, they like, even though the Godfather trilogy, for example, 1 and 2 are like masterpieces, and then 3 is literally being re-edited and some new footage being inserted to be released in cinemas later this year or next year. So even Coppola's, acknowledges that it's not great.
Yeah.
So
a lot of them fall at the third, don't they? I mean, Alien, Terminator. You know, the first 2 are brilliant, and then, you know, they just fall off a cliff. I mean, I'd have to say Star Wars as well. I mean, I quite like Return of the Jedi because it's the first thing I ever remember going to the cinema to see. But, you know, standing back and really analysing it, it doesn't really, you know, the tone of it just changes, doesn't it? You've got the whole Ewoks thing and that. So I don't think that can be, you know, put up there. So yeah, I think it's hard to argue for me, you know, whether there's many better than Back to the Future.
No, and I know people will crap all over Back to the Future Part 3, and we'll get to that shortly, but like I love that film. And there's certain things in that film that I think, you know, especially the fact that 2 and 3 were made together. There's some things like that we'll definitely talk about. But let's jump into the first part. Like, you know, to Back to the Future Part 1, or just Back to the Future as it was, is from 1985. And just to give the sort of usual stats, directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, and music by Alan Silvestri, one of the amazing Back to the Future anthem.
Yeah.
Starring Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Leah Thompson, Crispin Glover, Thomas F. Wilson, and I'm just throwing Claudia Wells in there as well, just because we'll talk about her changing in part 2. So the story really is weirdly simple and odd. 17-year-old Marty McFly is friends with not young Doc Brown. And, you know, we find that Marty McFly is a bit of a slacker. He's a bit of a sort of, he loves his music, but doesn't really love school. And, you know, he's one of the cool kids, all this kind of stuff, usual sort of 80s American blue-eyed boy. And he's friends with Doc Brown. And Doc Brown calls him to a parking lot of a mall, Twin Pines Mall, at 2 o'clock or something. Was it 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and unveils his time machine that he has made out of a DeLorean. After a demonstration, the two are attacked by Libyan terrorists, and in escaping, Marty McFly is sent back to 1955. And whilst back there, he inadvertently interferes with the relationship growing between his parents and has to change it all back to normal or make it better before he disappears from history altogether. So that's sort of the plot. But let's sort of start from the beginning then, really. So this whole relationship between Marty McFly and Doc Brown, it plays better in 1985 than it does in 2020, doesn't it?
It doesn't help. He looks a bit like Jimmy Savile, does it?
No, it really doesn't.
It's very wrong, isn't it? And of course, you've got Rick and Morty, who play that all up, don't you? I mean, I need to watch more of the Rick and Mortys, but I think it's one of those where obviously as a kid, when you're watching it, you don't even think about it, but it is a little bit strange, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, even Rick and Morty acknowledge it's weird. In the cartoon, they've now made it that Rick is Morty's granddad. It's his grandfather. So they've tried to they've got that connection. None of that seems to exist in Back to the Future. And like you say, he sort of like, the film starts with Marty going to Doc's place, and there's all the clocks, and he's playing that sort of like the guitar with that massive amp, like the massive speaker.
See, I think sorry to cut across you there, Scott. I think that's the only way I can kind of rationalize it, is that Doc is working on this experimental massive speaker. Marty's into his music. I mean, it's a slightly tenuous link, isn't it? But I remember thinking about this not so long ago and thinking, oh, okay, if you're going to hang your hat on anything, it's got to be the music.
Mm. Not to sound like Mike, as we've already said, but there is a comic.
There is a comic.
And I hate to be the one saying, but there is. So I think it's in IDW ran a series, and they have how they met is in that, and it explains it all.
Nice.
And I can't fully remember what it is, but it has been explained, and I think music does play a part of it. But yeah, it is weird. I mean, again, like, even now, I don't really think about it a great deal when I'm watching the film. But there's times you look back on it and you go, "Yeah, this is." It's like there must be the friendship's bizarre, because Marty calls him at Doc calls him at like 2. I don't know, was it 1, 2 in the morning?
Yeah.
And he's like, you come out to Twin Pines Mall. I've got friends that I've known for 20 plus years, and I'd be just like, piss off.
Yeah.
I'm in bed.
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it? There's no way. And yeah, what can you say about that? You've just got to go with it. I think there's loads of things in this movie. I mean, he's kind of, even when he's walking in and you've got all the clocks and stuff, and he seems to be a bit confused about the clocks, but he's got a fucking watch on. It just doesn't all really stack up.
No, that bit. I mean, like you say, it's sort of it's one of those things you just got to like you say, you let slide, isn't it? You got to, okay, I'm accepting that. I'm accepting the relationship and time travel. I've got to accept those two things, and the rest of the film sort of like I'm fine with.
Yeah.
Because when you do get to Twin Pines Mall, and this is one of the things that I love about this film is the fact that like Rob Zemeckis and Bob Gale clearly went through this with like a fine tooth comb. Because everything has a bit of a payoff.
Yeah.
So we know that like it's called Twin Pines Mall, and Marty, like when he travels back to the past, like he runs over a bunch of pines, because that's where the farm was, and when he comes back, it's called Lone Pines Mall. So it's like just little things like that. So good in this film. But he does go, and you obviously meet Doc, and you find out that he's turned a DeLorean into a time travel machine. And let's be honest, it's one of the most iconic looking vehicles. What are your thoughts on the time travel machine?
Absolutely genius move, because weren't they? I'm sure they were initially talking about it being a fridge freezer or something like that. That they had to go into, and they ended up with the DeLorean. Yeah. What I can't unsee now is the fact that when Marty turns up, Doc is back in the DeLorean, out of the truck.
Yeah.
You can't actually open the doors.
No, you're
Because-
right. How did he? I've always wondered that. I was the same because you see, it's sort of like how did he get in?
Yeah. Well, what he must have done, because when Marty turns up, he acts all surprised, doesn't he? But I reckon he's seen him come in, and he's like, oh, I'm going to drive into the truck, and I'm just going to wait for him, and it's going to look so fucking cool.
Yeah. And then I'm going to act all surprised.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even see you there. Did you see
Yeah.
me coming out of the truck there? How cool was that?
One thing I will say, you've actually just touched on something, and I don't know if you know this. Do you know the connection between Back to the Future and Indiana Jones?
I mean, I'm going to say there's a Spielberg connection, but not
is.
really.
Okay, you've literally just mentioned it. So
Okay.
in the original script for this, and I think it was because obviously Marty McFly is played by Michael J. Fox. He was originally be played by somebody else.
It was no, they wanted Fox at first.
They wanted Fox, but
yeah,
he had a sitcom, didn't he? That he couldn't get out of it.
It was Family Ties, and they ended up getting what's his name? He was in Memphis Belle. Eric Stoltz.
Eric Stoltz.
Yep.
Yeah. So when he auditioned, so Eric Stoltz actually sort of did it was a series of tweets or Facebook posts from it recently, and he said that the script he auditioned with was very, very different to the production script that was finally used.
Mm-hmm.
And the DeLorean came in a lot later as a design element and all this other stuff and changed the story. Originally, it was a fridge, and the fridge. Originally they didn't live in California; they lived in Arizona or Nevada. And do you know how that fridge traveled through time?
Wasn't it an atomic explosion?
It was an atomic explosion. So basically, it's atomic powered. And when he goes back to 1955, they have to take it back out to the desert for the nuclear weapon to be dropped on it. It's not a lightning bolt; it's a nuclear bomb to be dropped on the fridge to send Marty back through time. And it was obviously scrapped. And they went with the DeLorean idea, but this idea clearly stuck with Spielberg because in Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, we get Indiana Jones being blasted in a fridge by a nuclear weapon.
See, I'll be honest with you. I've erased all knowledge of that. I've ever seen that. I don't acknowledge it as a movie. For me, Indiana Jones is a trilogy.
I agree. It's one of those great trilogies.
Yeah.
But yeah, so so they did go with the DeLorean, and I'm so glad they did because I think the DeLorean is ace. And if they had gone with the fridge, I don't think we'd have the trilogy that we have now. The sort of the DeLorean facilitates the trilogy, really, doesn't it? It gives them that level of mobility.
Absolutely.
And I also like the fact that Doc Brown, like you say, he's obviously got this sort of 17-year-old friend, but clearly sort of dabbling in terrorism as well.
Well, again, for the first one, and I think the scripting, well, it's a little bit of a victim of its own success. The first one, I like. You mentioned Bob Gale. He obviously came up with the original concept, didn't he? He was just wondering about if I went back and met my dad and went to school with my dad, kind of what would that be like? I like, very simple ideas like that grow into something. I think with Highlander, you had some kid, on a school trip in Scotland and was just wondering, I wonder if, the people who were wearing these knight suits, the knight's armor, I wonder if they were walking around today, what would they think and how would they be? So really, really simple concept. But the writing for this first one is so tight. And even in that opening scene with all the clocks, you see a TV playing to no one. And they talk about the plutonium being stolen, yeah. And there is nothing wasted in this first one.
No, not at all. Well, I think that thing of sort of like, nuggets of information being dropped, it happens throughout the trilogy, especially the first two. And, of sort of where they basically tell you where the story's going to go if you're willing to, to look for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. And I do love this sort of thing when the Libyans get, the Libyans attack, because it's crazy. They're sort of attacking like a Volkswagen camper van.
They've got no lights on, and then they turn the lights on. I always, it takes me out of it a bit. I'm like, why didn't you have the lights on? It doesn't make sense to me.
No, but they have there's a great sort of chase around the parking lot, and it's sort of the line, sort of like Libyan, see if you can do 90, and Marty's stuck in the DeLorean, and we've seen that Doc's been shot as well, and that's it. Pff, off he goes, and he sort of fires through, and it's again that sort of the way it travels through time looks ace. You sort of get the flashes, and when it disappears, just the two sort of channels of flame where the tires were.
The one bit that I wish they would fix is when they're doing the test run with Einstein.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the two flames, and when Marty goes back into the past, it looks great.
Mm.
But when they do Einstein, and you get the flames underneath the feet of Marty and Doc.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks terrible. I don't know if it was a late addition, but I just wish they'd fix that.
It clearly looks like it, especially Marty. It looks like he's stood in the flames.
Yeah, it just looks so fake, doesn't it, and two-dimensional.
Yeah, but it's good. I mean, it's a great image. And so, but like I say, maybe get George Lucas on it and just tidy it up a bit, maybe.
Oh Christ, have fucking camel poop and
yeah. But like once this film sort of like, and this is the one thing I like about this franchise, is it sort of like it keeps taking left turns.
Mm-hmm.
Because the moment it goes back to 1955, like again, it's like you've had almost this sort of like little mini action set piece in the first act, and then the tone's just going to slow right down again, but not in a bad way, but like it just slows right back down to this thing of like, okay, here's this thing of this 1980s kid going back 30 years to 1955. And I just like this thing of like him sort of doing all the bits and pieces to establish where he is, when he is, and it shows you things. And this is again like you as you say, sort of one of the things we've really sort of not mentioned is Hill Valley, the town. So you've already been introduced to the town, and the town square, and save the clock tower. And again, like you say, nothing's wasted.
Yeah.
They're already saying save the clock tower because it was struck 30 years ago and hasn't worked since. They're going to tear it down and stuff. And so when you go back, it's that set and that town set, and again, it just looks ace. Another little tidbit, of course, it's this Hill Valley is also the same set that was used for Gremlins. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, same town centre. So that is shot at different angles and stuff. But yeah, that's also Gremlins. But yeah, what are your thoughts then? So when it gets back to 1955.
I'll be honest with you, Scott. When it goes back to 1955, all of my brain cells are focused on Leah Thompson.
Yeah.
I mean, now what I will say is this is I guess we think of Back to the Future, this first one, as this wholesome family movie. And I've watched it with my kids as well. And it does get confusing, especially when we get to the second one. And then they go to the future, which is 2015. And I'm watching it with my son. And 2015 is also in the past.
Yeah.
So it gets a bit confusing for the kids. And what, we don't have flying hoverboards? I know, son. I know. It annoys me as well.
We feel your pain.
But when I guess before we meet Leah Thompson, getting back to the slight wrongness, it's not quite the family wholesome movie. I mean, George McFly is a fucking dirty pervert, isn't he? Just trying to perv on.
He's a peeping Tom. Yeah.
But again, I don't know if in the 80s, Peeping Tom was like considered just, oh, you cheeky old scamp, and like Biff, oh, he's a bit rapey, that Biff one. You got to watch him,
This is what I find, like you say, this film, parts of it age really well. And I think sort of, some of the actors in it are fantastic, but like, yeah, it's sexual politics really don't age well. And they never say that it's good. I mean, that's the thing. Like, but George McFly is a peeping Tom. He's not even subtle. Like, he's on the bough of a tree over a road. He thinks that no one can see him. It's really bizarre. But we'll get to Biff in a bit because I realised, having watched this trilogy like in quite quick succession for this, Thomas F. Wilson, who plays Biff, is actually the MVP of this trilogy. more so than anybody else, I think. He does the most, and I think he is absolutely brilliant in all the films. But
So, sorry, what? I'm trying to. You've lost me there with that acronym. What was that? MVP?
most valued player.
Oh, right. Okay. There we go.
He's yeah. I mean, he plays in this. He's Biff,
Yeah.
young and old, and we'll get onto the old age makeup in a bit. But he plays young Biff and old Biff, and then like he plays in the two. He plays really old Biff, young Biff,
Yeah.
and middle aged Biff, all in one film, and then in different timelines as well, so different times. And then in the third one, he plays, and then he plays. Oh, in the second one, he plays Griff as well, to his grandson. And then he plays Buford Tannen in the third one. Like the guy is just excellent. Like you forget that he does all that stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree that he is a brilliant baddie. Really brilliant, iconic, and to pull off all those different roles, they're slightly different, especially when he's acting, old Biff, talking to young Biff and stuff like that. I think he's brilliant. I don't know though. So I've seen the Eric Stoltz footage. So before they got Michael J. Fox, and he basically had to film Family Ties when they agreed. It's just not working with Eric Stoltz. We have to get Michael J. Fox in. Michael J. Fox ended up filming Family Ties in the daytime, and then in the nighttime filming this. And you just think, Christ, how many actors today would put themselves through that? Just for this particular part. So if you watch that old footage, there is some magic missing. It's all the same set. It's all the same scenes. It's the same lines. But and Eric Stoltz is a decent actor, but he just doesn't have that charm that Michael J. Fox has. So I think you're right. And, as Biff in particular, I think, Thomas F. Wilson is fantastic. But I think I think it's just a great all-round cast, to be honest.
It is. No, I agree with that. You're right. I mean, Michael J. Fox is the heart of the film. Like he is, he is obviously he's our point of view character. He's the heart of the film. And you're right. He has a real charm and a charisma that you sort of, you want to follow. I mean, what the point I'd say is that from the moment you meet him, and he's obviously a known entity within the school because you've got Strickland. Mr. Strickland, who is another great reoccurring character in this whole series.
Yeah.
Who says like, you're a slacker, just like your dad was your father was a slacker, and you're a slacker, and you're never going to amount to anything. And you get this feeling like he's just a typical teenager, sort of like he's a bit cheeky, he's a bit cool, he's sort of like he's he seems a bit like he's almost like almost a little bit Ferris Bueller-esque, but not quite as
much of a slacker.
Yeah, he's not as sociopathic as Ferris Bueller is, really.
I still think there's a whole Fight Club thing going on there with Ferris Bueller, but that's a discussion for another day.
But you're right, and he definitely has a magic and a charm, especially with like Christopher Lloyd, and also with Crispin Glover. Again, he has a really good chemistry with all the cast. But yeah, but like I say, we were saying like the way that the cast is good, but the way they also get introduced, you were saying like this you consider this a wholesome family film, but it has got like some real cheeky moments in it that, like you say, you think back and you go, "Oof, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I should have seen this the age I saw it at."
I don't think they'd make it like that today. I mean, we've said about George McFly, but Christ, his mum. Leah Thompson, she is horny. She's like, he can stay in my room, and I think initially when he wakes up, he's got no pants on, has he? So who knows what was in that deleted scene?
Yeah, that's it. And, she knows what it's called, Calvin Klein,
because they were on his tighty whities.
Yeah. So you do think like, well, how far did she look? Yeah. Again, though, I like the fact that there's some jokes at this point where you meet his the generation before, so his uncle that's in jail is sort of like always in the kid pen.
Yeah.
and there's sort of those sorts of jokes. And I like the fact he's wearing like a puffer, like a gilet jacket, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And they all just assume he's a sailor. it's like a life jacket, and that's a good joke that keeps coming up. So, yeah, it's I don't know. This introduction of the 50s is quite cool. I enjoy it. I enjoy this sort of rolling out of sort of information, like because a lot of it's just told you, and a lot of it's there.
Yeah.
But one of my favourite ones is his introduction to 55 Doc Brown. And I'm never entirely sure how old Doc Brown's supposed to be. I've always taken it maybe he's supposed to be in his 60s in 85, and so he's in his sort of 30s in 55. I think that's what I make that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
But this whole introduction, where he pulls him in, he's got the big sort of thing on his head, and he's trying to do sort of mind reading. Again, like there's an energy to Christopher Lloyd. That again, sort of, I don't know if you've ever seen films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and
Yeah.
he just has a certain like manic energy in those, but he perfects it, I think, in this as Doc Brown, and especially sort of like the 55 Doc Brown.
Yeah. 1.21 gigawatts.
Yeah.
I think he's one of those actors, isn't he, that for the dummy runs, I can't remember what they call them, but, for the walkthroughs, the practices and what have you, he'll give like 60% of his performance. But when it's actually time to shoot, he, just leaps into action and into life. And so, I think, I'm sure I've heard that, they basically pretended the dummy runs are like the real thing just to get him to actually
really
put his all
up
into it,
Yeah.
So but absolutely iconic. And I'm the same as you. I was a bit confused because young Doc Brown he never really looked that different to old Doc Brown to me.
No, but again, they take the Mickey out of that in the second film, don't they? They sort of because he says when he comes back from 2015, he's like, I had a rejuvenation thing. Yeah, and he takes off a fake face and looks no different, and even Marty's like, right, all right, okay.
But also, they haven't invented Grecian 2000.
No,
to sort his hair out.
Yeah. But he looks like the quintessential mad scientist, doesn't he? Like, if you're going to draw like a crazy doctor, like a professor, like that's what you draw. He looks just like that. One of the things, actually, in fact, I've just thought of it in my head because it was part of something I remember from a while ago. Is we talked about the relationship between Marty and Doc, and I can't even remember if this is actually in the IDW version. Having met him in 1955. He comes back and he meets Doc. For Doc, it's the first time, and then he has to go through, and Doc obviously knows that time travel exists. Almost like in a weird sort of like Terminator sort of predeterminist kind of thing. I have a feeling that Doc seeks out Marty, knowing that all this is supposed to take place. But I can't remember. I'm going to have to find that out. I'll have to come back to the sort of maybe like an edit in for that, just to sort of confirm that.
So it's going to be like the first time. How did John Connor come to be if you didn't get Michael Biehn sent back from the future?
That's it. Yeah. That's a whole different discussion. I'm going to go for a long time on that one. But yeah, no, I love the way they interact again because he sort of the way he convinces him. And he talks about the flux capacitor, which is sort of like the magic wand MacGuffin of this series. Sort of like it's the thing that makes time travel possible. How? Don't ask. It just does.
You know what this is, Scott? This is, and thank God there are no prequels to Back to the Future.
Yeah.
This is the Force for me. It's like the Force is, what penetrates us, binds us. It's basically it's magic. The flux capacitor, it's the magic thing that makes time travel possible. That's it. It's all I need to know. I don't need to know that midichlorians, power this flux capacitor or anything. That's the start and end of it. I'm good. Let's move on.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's just sort of like it looks, and again, it's one of those things. It's a really simple design. It's got the flux capacitor. It's got sort of like a slightly daft name, and you just sort of accept it and go on, and that's why you sort of have again like Doc's reaction to it when it takes 1.21 gigawatts or gigawatts to power it. it becomes this sort of the MacGuffin, doesn't it? That's the thing you've got to power to get back through time.
Yeah.
Um,
But of course, you've got the whole thing. I mean, Doc talks a lot, doesn't he, about we can't mess with the space time continuum. But when it's convenient, he's quite happy to do it then.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, because Marty had he was the one who got knocked over. It should have been George McFly. You end up with this side story. So not only is he trying to get back to the future, but he's trying to make sure Lorraine and George fall in love as well. And I do like that interaction. And I guess this is what the original idea of it was. When old Bob Gale was sitting down to write it, was that interaction between Marty and his dad.
Yeah, and it works out well because again, Marty has to go back to school in the 50s, and I like the fact that you find out that like his dad was a real nerd. Like I mean, you've been introduced to sort of like 80s, sort of like in his 30s or late 40s at this point, I suppose. George McFly, bit of a loser, but you find out like he's a proper nerd, 50s nerd as well, and a real wimp. Again, Crispin Glover is one of those unusual actors that you sort of never really sure what you're going to get from him.
Yeah.
But he's really good as George McFly. But again, but there's a real spark between Michael J. Fox and Crispin Glover. They do work well together. But again, when you actually have like Crispin Glover or George McFly trying to sort of do, what is it, in the diner where he sort of tries to do to woo Leah Thompson's character, and it goes sort of badly wrong. He's really sort of almost like sweet and sincere the way he does it. It's slightly creepy, but still sort of like sincere.
He's an all right peeping Tom, isn't he?
That's the thing. Like you can't. I'm trying to sort of get past that. Like he's clearly a perv. But he seems like a genuinely sort of like nice guy. But you're trying to get. They don't sort of try to address that again, do they? They're like, oh, just forget about that bit. It doesn't matter.
He's like a slightly more handsome Roy Cropper, isn't he?
Yeah, it's all a bit dodgy. But I think the only way they make George like more appealing is this is where you get introduced to Biff.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, yeah, George is a perv, but at least he's not like, say, like a rapey bully like Biff is. And this is one of the weird things as well, because Biff comes with a crew. And one of the things to point out is Billy Zane is part of his crew as well. And Billy Zane stays part of his crew throughout sort of like the second film as well, which is, again, a really cool sort of touch that they keep up. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this whole sort of interaction then with Biff? Like the introduction of Biff and in the diner?
I love it. It is brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, I've actually got goosebumps just thinking about it now. When there's a couple of things to point out. The size difference. You get that real kind of Rocky IV moment, don't you, with Ivan Drago, when Biff actually stands up to reveal his full height, and he's sort of looking down at Marty, and you can see in Michael J. Fox's eyes, it's like, oh shit. But he does the old trick, which kind of puts him in good stead for the whole trilogy, really, which is look over there, and kind of legs it. And then you get that thing where he kind of gets the old skateboard, he nicks it off a kid, doesn't he, and rips off the top bit. And you end up with this chase. I mean, Biff not only being a bit rapey, but, that could have gone... Is he trying to kill Marty at that point? I mean, it sort of seemed like it, didn't it?
I was going to say, that if he starts trying to ram him on the back of the truck, doesn't he? And like you say, if it had gone wrong, like I'm pretty sure like Marty wouldn't have been walking away from it. So Biff to me is I don't know if you're like a Stephen King fan or if you've ever watched like It.
The original.
Biff, yeah, so Stephen King hates greasers. Never entirely sure why. He just does. but they always have this sort of thing of like whenever he puts greasers into his stories, like they're always like psychopaths, like inexplicably. And that's the thing in it. There's a character called Henry Bowers in it that is just a nutcase. And that's sort of what Biff is. It's sort of like there's no explanation for it. He's just clearly like he's not just a bully. Like, you know, he's clearly a psychopath.
Yeah.
And you know, he's obviously bigger than everyone and this other stuff. But like, there's more to it than that. There's clearly some damage there. And yeah, I don't think he's bothered by anybody. And if he accidentally killed someone, I don't think he would be too bothered.
No, I don't think so at all. And you know, Bob Gale, I think you can draw more parallels with the second one, but he claimed the whole Biff character was based on Donald Trump.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. It does show more in the second one.
Yeah.
We'll get to that very soon. Because even with Biff, like you say, when you get to the climax of the film, it's the sort of the under the sea dance. Like he is clearly going to rape Lorraine.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and he has got no compunctions about that. Like like he's there for that. And it's sort of. There's a weirdness in the film where even like, you know, George is almost willing to walk away, and it's not so much like, oh, I've been beaten to it. It's almost like there's almost like an inevitability to it for him. That it's sort of like, nah, it's almost like this is what happens in the 50s. It's like it's so weird to watch it now, to think like this is, you know,
Wrong.
Biff isn't just like, Biff isn't just a sort of a bit of a baddie. Like Biff is like a real danger. Like he should be in some sort of institution.
Yeah.
Following some of this.
But do you not think as well? You know, it's like, well, I'm sure this wasn't totally like this in the 50s, and you know, unfortunately, I'm sure bad things did happen, and you know, but the fact that we all watched it in the 80s and we thought again, you know, oh, Biff, he's a bit of a school bully. No, this is a little bit more than that, you know, because he's saying to his mates, isn't he? This ain't no peep show. So everyone's just complicit. Everyone's just like turning a blind eye. She's literally screaming for help in the car. And I don't think I watched this for about 10 years or something. And it was one of those when I saw the trilogy come out on Blu-ray. I was like, oh, I've got to buy that. But then it just sat on my shelf for ages and didn't watch it. And then I watched it, having not watched it for about 10 years. And I was like, it got to this scene. And I was like, fucking hell.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember it, but I don't remember having the same reaction to it as well. It was just... Again, it's just... I don't think you'd have that in a family movie today, would you?
No. Well, I think the thing is, as sort of like, there are certain things I will concede. That there are certain films in the 80s that have scenes that, you know, are either done off the cuff or they're sort of like, you know, a little bit, they're like a small scene that in the 80s would have gone like, meh. But now you look back on it and you're like, no, that's really problematic. I mean, my favourite film of all time, there's a scene in it in which a certain Dr. Venkman appears to have
300 cc's and chlorine.
Yeah, he basically appears to have a syringe full of a date rape drug on his person. I will defend that to everything. If you read the novelization, there's an explanation for it. But again, it's not in the film.
What about trying to rig his psychological tests so the young
there's no explanation. That. I will admit that's even worse in the novelization.
Oh, really?
It's blatant in the novelization as to what he intends to do to this co-ed. So it's a little bit, you're like, oh no, Mr. Venkman, or Dr. Venkman, you are a real problem character. And I think the thing is that if you watch even like Goonies, like there are certain things in Goonies that you're a bit like, you know, it doesn't quite play for a modern audience. And so, you know, when you watch this, you think, oh, okay, in the 80s, this was probably played, and people went, yeah, he's a baddie. But now you watch it and you're like, no, some of these characters are really, you know, really problematic. Even like Mr. Strickland, like his attitude as a teacher, like he basically seems to hate all students. yet has been a teacher for 30+ years.
Yeah, see, I went to school in the 80s. I knew a few teachers like that, to be honest. So I don't think he's that unbelievable. Hates his job, just hates kids.
Yeah,
But he's there
that's
for the
probably true.
pension.
Yeah.
But can I mention Scott as well? So
Mm.
even before we get to rapey Biff there, how close does Marty come to nailing his mum?
Well, let's turn that around. How close does his mum get to nailing Marty? I think is
But his mum doesn't know that it's his son.
no.
He knows. He's the one with the knowledge.
Yeah,
And you
that's
can
true.
tell in his face, he's kind of looking. She's got a low cut dress, and he's like, "Oh," you can tell he's having this real internal
Dilemma.
battle with himself. He's genuinely considering
Yeah.
it. It should not be a thing. It should.
Well, it's that, yeah, there is a moment. It's funny because he's shocked that she smokes, she's shocked that she drinks, and then she comes on to him. And like you say, there does appear to be that flash in his eye where he's a bit like you say, it's a dilemma for a second.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, it should never be a dilemma. It's weird. Yeah.
Maybe that was how the first John Connor was made.
Yes, maybe, yeah. Some really uncomfortableness. Because then the thing is, with that having happened, because that happens in his sphere of knowledge, as you say, he has knowledge of that.
Mm-hmm.
When he goes back to 1985, like I don't. If I was him, I'd have like trouble like looking my mum in the face. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, yeah, no, mum. I know that you were a randy little tart when you were a teenager. Like,
but actually, I mean, you're a parent, Scott. Do you not think? I mean that kind of is. I think our kids have no idea that we were kids as well.
yeah,
And I know it's definitely true of mine because the way they try and bullshit me sometimes, I'm like, come on. I was a kid as well,
We've all been there. Yeah.
And they haven't even got to the awkward teenager years just yet, so got all that to look forward to. But yeah, so I don't think knowing that your mum was a bit horny and a bit out there, because at the beginning of the movie she's really dour, isn't she? She's run down. Well, that's fucking the life of her parents, isn't it?
Yes,
I remember my mum saying, "You'll understand when you have kids." I'm like, yeah, whatever, mum. I'm always going to be cool. And then you end up being the fucking authoritarian, like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the weirdest thing though is that everyone seems to have collective amnesia that Marty ever existed when he goes back to the future.
Well, this is one of the things of this thing. Like, say, when he does go back, at no point, like, because even like the clothes that he is wearing, when he goes back, and he obviously knows Calvin Klein and all this other stuff. Like, at no point does his mum or dad go, "You look." In fact, his dad should be looking at him and going, "You look incredibly like a kid I used to know in the 50s. Lorraine, can we have a conversation?"
Yeah. Yeah. Lorraine.
yeah. Where were you 17 years ago?
And he's got the same name as this lad who was trying to set me up with you. What's going on there?
Yeah. It does. I mean, even like, because Biff, like, as older Biff in the 80s, like, they have some quite up close and personal, sort of like, quite aggressive interactions. And at no point does middle-aged Biff feel going like, you're looking really familiar to someone I used to know.
Even the mum and dad, so George and Lorraine, they're like, oh, it's so when you get the dweeb Biff, he's beaten down, waxing the car and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, Biff, if it wasn't for him, we'd have never got together. That time he nearly raped you. He helped us get together there. But they don't remember Marty at all.
There's
quite
no
crazy.
acknowledgement of it at all.
Let's put it this way, Scott, right? So 30 years ago from now would be 1990 for us right now.
Yeah.
So if basically someone who was a dead ringer for like a mid-20s Paul Gascoigne walked in, it's not as if you've forgotten him, is it? You'd be like, fucking hell, how's that happened? You look like, 1990 Paul Gascoigne. So, yeah.
It is a bit of a hole. We say how sort of tight the plot is, but there's definitely a couple of little holes like that. That's true. But you get to the climax, like he does. The good thing is, like, he's obviously pumped. He's given George all this education. He sort of pumped him up, and I do love the bit when George stands up to Biff.
Yeah.
And you say you got about goosebumps from the bit with the skateboard and stuff, and that is great. There's a moment in this though when Biff when George turns around and says, "Hey, you get your damn hands off," and Biff stands up to him and he sort of twists his arm around, and George just loses it and punches him out.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it is so satisfying because of everything you've gone through with these characters. I'm like, it's a really satisfying moment. And it's I genuinely I don't know, it's just something about that moment in that film. It's just so sort of like, yes, every time I see it.
It's great, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, the baddie of the piece, so Biff, he gets his comeuppance. He gets properly knocked out. I can't let go from the fact that it's physically impossible. Kind of where the way he's got George's arm twisted there, he'd have to be Mr. Fantastic or something to be able to get a swing in. But I can get past that. It is a brilliant moment when he just knocks him out. And, from future Biff, it appears that was a life-changing moment for him.
Well, again, it's one of those things, and they always say that, the moment you stand up to a bully, it sort of, that's what sort of breaks them. And I think you get this is the moment the myth of Biff Tannen is broken. You can imagine this for the whole school. Is all of a sudden this moment of this guy who's been this sort of like bullying overlord for years was taken out by George McFly. Once that gets round, like the myth, this sort of like aura that would have been around Biff Tannen would just disappear, wouldn't it? Everyone would be like, oh, what a prat! He got taken out by George McFly. I can imagine it would have, especially as a teenager, would have some sort of like psychological damage to you. So,
apart from the fact that he's built like a brick shithouse, and in the second movie we see after he wakes up, he goes chasing after Marty, doesn't he? So, I think it's one of those. It is one of those myths. If you stand up to a bully, they don't like it and they'll leave you alone. And I'll never forget my uncle. Unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. But I remember when I was probably late teens. And, around that time, one of the adages was the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And he said, David, the bigger they are, the harder they hit you.
Yeah.
And he was bloody right. So, but especially around the 80s, you had all these little kind of Disney-fied adages, don't you? These fairy tales.
And that's exactly what this is, isn't it? It's the sort of the underdog gets the girl. That's the sort of it's the revenge of the nerds kind of thing. But you're right, because we've already seen that Biff is willing to try and run someone over to teach him a lesson. So in reality, he would have got up, walked into the Under the Sea dance, dragged George McFly into the car park, and beaten the crap out of him.
Stuck a knife in him, probably.
Yeah, probably. We know that that would not have been the end of it. But it is really satisfying, and it also leads then to the sort of the end is because one of the band has injured their hand. They have to play a certain song, or they have to play certain music so that George and Lorraine can dance and they can kiss, and then that can start the relationship and that sort of thing. And so Marty takes to the stage to play guitar, which then goes right back to the beginning, obviously, because we've seen that he plays guitar, he wants to be in Battle of the Bands and all that sort of stuff. So again, all this stuff sort of paying off. And I love this overexcited rendition of Johnny Be Good at the end.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And I seem to remember in and around this time in the 80s, Johnny Be Good just seemed to have a renaissance. It seemed to be in so many movies that I watched. But yeah, he's pretty good. But it always jars with me a little bit that's not Michael J. Fox singing. It's kind of a bit weird. And then you've got the guy who's on the phone to Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
So again, we get this like, well, where did Johnny Be Good come from originally? Did Marty always go back? Are we in a kind of loop kind of thing here, or what?
It's weird, isn't it? Because this is the thing I will mention. I mean, the one thing to mention is, like you said, you may not be ready for that, but your kids are going to love it. I'm thinking, well, actually, Johnny Be Good was released in the 50s.
Yeah.
In fact, it was released 3 years later, so it probably would be for them. It's just that the wild guitar, I suppose, which should have been like Hendrix and everybody else that comes
Yeah.
after that, was in the 60s. Yeah, no, it's just, the time travel in this is. We won't get too deep into this with him, but time travel in this sort of can't seem to make its mind up. It's either deterministic or it's changeable. And for the most part, the main story is telling you that it's changeable because you literally have two timelines. You introduced to a timeline in the future. In '85, where George and Lorraine have had a hard 30 years. They're worn down. George is still the nerd, and she probably regrets it. They've got three kids who are all a bit sort of like slackers, and the McFlys are a bit of a disappointment. And it's through these events that he goes back to, and he alters history to produce a new and better future. And to me, so that's a non-deterministic future. That's the ability to change time. However, as you say, they keep throwing in these deterministic things where, well, that must have always happened in order for this other thing to happen. So, like you say, Chuck Berry being introduced to this kind of music, well, if he didn't hear it on the stage, if his mate didn't introduce it to him because Marty was playing, like, how did he hear it? And yeah, Mayor Goldie Wilson. That's another good one.
Oh, yeah.
So who planted the idea in his head of becoming mayor in the first place? If it's Marty did it this time round, we see it in this one, for him to become Mayor Goldie Wilson. But who did it the first time? How did that happen the first time round? Well, it's things like that that's a deterministic future. That's always going to have happened. That always did happen. Always will happen. Will always happen. But all the other stuff doesn't. So it plays with time travel a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the thing is with the Chuck Berry thing, I'm guessing that came in quite late into the script, and it was one of those, it's just a little gag, isn't it? It's a bit play around.
Yeah.
They don't think that, 30 or 35 years later, you're going to have a couple of nerds. And, well, it's not just us, is it? I'm sure there's lots and lots of people agonizing about the rules of time travel. It's like, look, fuck off, nerds. We just wanted to make a funny line. That was it. But it's the fact that what jars with me more than the inconsistency with time travel is that when the guy's on the phone to Chuck Berry, he's like, hey, it's your cousin Marvin Berry. It's like, you shouldn't have to qualify what your surname is.
If you're saying it's your cousin, they should know.
Your first name should be enough, I'm sure. So that bugs me a bit, but I try and get over it, but I can't.
Yeah, I do know what you mean. So it makes me chuckle with the way he says it as well. So
yeah,
but it is. It's a good rendition, and I do think it's good fun. But this takes us to the sort of like the grand finale, sort of. The whole thing has been sort of, like you say, you've had this thing of going back and seeing your dad at school, sort of thing. But what we are introduced to is this sort of the third act. The finale is the clock tower is going to be struck by lightning, and again, it was all there since the flyer at the start of the film, sort of like Chekhov's leaflet, if you will. Save the clock tower, struck by lightning at this time on this date.
That. Chekhov's leaflet.
And so you get this third act. I love this third act. This whole finale is absolutely phenomenal. The music and the tension, and it's going to be fine. I know he's going to get home. I every time I watch it, I know it's going to happen. But the moment the tree comes down and pulls the plug out, and Doc has to climb the clock tower, it's ace. Am I overselling it, or what do you think?
No, I think, you mentioned Alan Silvestri before. The iconic music, that you get, but the whole scoring throughout it, I think, is brilliant. And the way they build up the stakes. And actually, I like, throughout the trilogy, even though the time travel's kind of inconsistent, I like how they keep it fairly simple. And explain everything. Obviously, I've not watched Tenet yet, but I've got absolutely no reason to, because everyone who I speak to says basically they didn't understand it. So, whereas this is nice and simple, easily digestible, what the stakes are. You've got that sense that time is running out, that if they don't, if the dock doesn't get the the cables hooked up just in time for the lightning, they'll miss that window of opportunity, and Marty will be stuck in the past. It just feels tense. And like you say, even though I've watched it 100 times probably now, you just get that sense. And I think a lot of it does owe to the music.
Mm. Yeah, the score in this is good. It is so good that sort of. I've got it playing in my head like right now.
Yeah, it's hard not
Um,
to, isn't it? You go,
yeah, yeah, it is great. It's one of those iconic '80s. Like there's John Williams, Alan Silvestri, and a couple of others that sort of like basically sort of scored my childhood. But yeah, this sort of the whole time with the sort of having to get the hook on that wire at the right time, and the storm sort of coming in. It's just so well done, and it's so great. And again, like Christopher Lloyd's perfect in it. It's just a really just a really satisfying payoff throughout the whole thing. And he gets to go home, and it's sort of. I like the fact that it's sort of everything sort of circles round, and this is a film where, like, if they didn't have the last 30 seconds or the last minute of the film, like, it could just be a perfect one piece, couldn't it? Like, this is a really perfect sort of like finished film, because you get obviously he gets back, and Doc was shot by the Libyans. He gets back, and you find out that actually that Marty had written him a letter in '55, but he'd ripped it up. But Doc had actually read it and had worn a bulletproof vest. It's now Lone Pines Mall. You now see that, so time has changed. You're now in a different timeline. The Doc has survived, which tells me that he actually died. You did see him die at the start of the film.
Oh, yeah.
So, because you are in a different timeline now. So he survived, and he goes home, and then he wakes up in the morning, and you find out his family are in a better place, and that George has written a sci-fi novel and all this other stuff.
It's such an 80s wrap up, isn't it? Because a lot of it is to do with how much stuff they have.
Yeah,
They're minted, so therefore life is better.
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit weird, because it's that thing of, like, they clearly have gone for something wholesome, which is they're more well adjusted. They've reached their dreams. They're happier as a couple. Oh yeah, and they're rich and got big cars. It's definitely, they couldn't help have that in the '80s, because that's obviously was the thing. And Biff is no longer, because I think he was like a second-hand car salesman or something. Oh no, they work in the same office, don't they? Biff and George in the original timeline. And in this one, you've got Biff he's waxing the car out the front. He's got his own business or whatever. But he's a bit of a dweeb now. He's sort of like, obviously life sort of has been cruel to him, sort of thing. So that's almost where it ends. And if it ended there, it would be a one-off, and you'd be done. But they have a tack on. Now, I never knew. I still don't know, and I think I've probably been told it and forgotten. But Doc turns up with the DeLorean, and he's wearing sort of like some crazy clothes, and he turns up, and Marty's with his girlfriend Jennifer, and he says, "We've got to go to the future. We've got a problem. Is it worse if we turn into dickheads?"
No, what is it? We turn into assholes or something?
Yeah. And he says, "No, you're fine. It's to do with your kids, Marty." And then they have a Mr. Fusion, so he puts the rubbish in, which I love. Is a great little touch. And then he says, "Where we're going?" He says, "Well, you got to back up, Doc. We haven't got enough space to get up to 88. So we're going. We don't need roads," which is a great line. And the DeLorean takes off and flies off, and that's the end. And it says to be continued. But I don't know. A bit like how Star Wars wasn't called A New Hope and Part 4 and stuff until later on. I'm never entirely sure. Was this always going to be a continuation? Like, was it a case of, like, if it didn't do well, it would have just obviously been stopped, or did they have the remaining story? I'm never sure.
I think at one point I knew the answer to this. I don't think it did initially. and I'm trying to rapidly Google because I think they added that in later. But I can't actually see it quickly. I'm sure if you'd have asked me this before, I don't. I think it was added in later.
Yeah,
I'm going to put my.
I think so
self out
too.
there.
I seem to think I seem to have this in my head. It was added in later, the to be continued.
Yeah.
I think it was supposed to be a bit of a sort of like a tease, but nothing else. And the to be continued came in later. I'm glad they did because it's a great, it leads on to a great story. But yeah, so that's Back to the Future 1. Great Scott! I'm going to have to interrupt you just there. This has only been part 1. We've covered Back to the Future. Dave and I have discussed the first part in this trilogy, but we will be back. We'll be at part 2, and we will be discussing part 2 and part 3. I've really enjoyed going back into this series and checking out these films. They really are fantastic. But our real thoughts, what we're going to get into is, which is the best film in the series? What do we think of there being a Western environment for the third film? Is it a bridge too far? Is it a gigawatt too far? But we will be back. So thank you for listening. And check out the next part of the retrospective in the next episode, coming in a couple of weeks. But what do you think about the first Back to the Future film? Let us know. Is Thomas F. Wilson the real MVP of this film series, or do you think there's somebody else? Do you think it's dated well? Do you think it still stands up as an 80s classic? What do you think the relationship between Doc and Marty? Let us know what your thoughts are. If you want to get in contact, please reach out, find us. You can email me at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. You can find me on all the social medias, all under 20th Century Geek. So 20th Century Geek, so it's at 20th Century Geek on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Find us. We are there. Come and talk to us. More importantly, though, if you like what it is we do, help us keep the lights on at 20th Century Towers. We have a Patreon page where I do a monthly podcast called 30-Minute Thoughts, where I give my rambling thoughts on a specific genre topic of that month, chosen by my Patreons. But if you don't want to be a Patreon, there are other things you can do. We have an Amazon gift list. Check it out. There's a whole lot of stuff on that Amazon gift list that helps do the research. And we love second-hand books at 20th Century Towers. But again, that costs money. Doesn't matter. Check out your podcast catcher. If you like listening to this, just go on there and give us a review. 5 stars is preferable. 5 stars would be extremely great. I'd be extremely grateful for a 5-star review. But if you don't think we're worth 5 stars, that's fine too. Let us know. Put a review on there. I love to hear it back. But in the meantime, have a great time. And I shall see you on the next episode when we talk about Back to the Future Part 2 and 3. Thank you very much.